So, Sheila was there that day. She watched as Samuel stopped in front of every one of Jesse's boys to see if he was the one God had chosen to be the new king. And she said, I might have expected God would do something unusual, but it was still a shock when Jesse's oldest son wasn't chosen. I mean, he had everything. Tall, dark, handsome. He was the complete package, a tested warrior in the army of of King Saul. His younger brothers, when he was passed over, kind of poked each other and smirked and puffed up their chest to prepare for Samuel to pass by them, each one. But one by one, no one was the right one. And with each son, Samuel looked more perplexed. Had he gotten the message wrong? Did GPS send him to the wrong address? His God positioning system? So when Samuel asked if he had any more sons, Jesse laughed and said, oh yeah, that's right, I do have one more son. But he's just a sweet boy. We'll send for him anyway. And so several brothers ran through the pastures looking for David. He was out watching sheep. Although to be honest, most of the time he wasn't really watching. He was too busy running around trying to catch butterflies or laying on his back and watching clouds pass over. That one looks like a duck. Or singing or playing his harp or daydreaming. And occasionally he'd look over to see that the sheep were still there. And yet, to his credit, he could sense when a predator was approaching. And he could whip out his slingshot in 10 seconds flat and use a single stone to put down a wolf or even a bear. These sheep were in good hands with the good shepherd, even if he was easily distracted. And so the brothers ran with David back to Samuel and Jesse. And right as he approached, David tripped over a rock and fell face first, right in front of Israel's great prophet, Samuel. Jesse gave Samuel a look like, you see why I forgot? But David just brushed the dirt off his clothes and grinned ear from ear, his apple cheeks red from embarrassment, but he stood up and did his best to look tall and an adult. And Samuel said, it's you. This clumsy boy was exactly what God was looking for. And then Jesse pulled him aside and said, he's my boy. While the brothers looked on in disbelief. God chose who? The question is, why? Why was Samuel there in the first place? He was looking for a replacement for the very king he himself picked. Well, reluctantly picked, because if you remember last week, the people demanded to have a king. They felt insignificant as they looked around at the surrounding nations and decided that if they had a king, well, then they could be prosperous and powerful too. If only we could be like everyone else. So with God's consent, Samuel did as they demanded, but not before telling them what they can expect from a king. God warned them, a king will use you and abuse you and take from you what he wants until you have nothing left and you end up his slave. But it didn't matter. They wanted a king just like everyone else. So a king they got. And so Samuel was directed to anoint handsome Saul, a foot taller than everyone else. And at the beginning, he did some impressive things. He came up with an organizational plan that rallied men to come from every tribe for the defense of a small town. And finally, they had a victory. He was a hero. But then he started acting like a king, and the people didn't like it. I mean, we wanted a king, not someone who acts like a king. And as the years went by, it got worse. Saul was carried away with his sense of power and began to make excuses and rationalize some of the decisions that were directly in opposition to his instructions. He thought he knew better than Samuel and God. Now, kings may have been kings, but they still had to follow the law. No one is above the law? And there were certain things only religious leaders could do. One time Saul waited for 7 days for Samuel to show up to make sacrifice and offer a blessing so they could go into battle. And Saul grew impatient and decided he could do it himself. So when Samuel arrived that same day and learned what Saul had done, he was outraged and declared that one day Saul would be replaced with someone who would actually love the Lord more than his own self. And then another time he got caught in a lie. So, trigger warning, disturbing details. At the end of one battle with the Amalekites, he was supposed to kill everything, every person, every animal. So, understatement, that's a problem. But in the context of this story, the problem was that he decided to hold some animals back. Samuel arrived and asked, well, why do I hear sheep bleating and cows mooing? Oh, I wanted to hold them back so you could sacrifice them. Big fat lie. And Samuel said, to obey is better than to sacrifice. And Saul begged for forgiveness, but Samuel refused and never spoke to him again. It's said that even God regretted choosing Saul, and it's interesting to ponder the idea that an all-powerful, omniscient, omnipresent God would have such things as regrets. I mean, isn't the idea that God is always right? Anyway, God tasked Samuel with finding a new king and was directed to find him among the smallest of the tribes, specifically, as you heard, Jesse in Bethlehem. So, a quick backstory. So, Jesse, his great-grandma was Ruth. She was a Moabite, as in those damn Moabites. Jesse's grandfather was conceived after a night on the threshing floor, a forbidden encounter between a foreigner and Boaz. So, Jesse's household should have been the last one which God would direct Samuel to find a new king. So it really says something that he was sent to pick the apple-cheeked youngest from a perfectly ordinary family in the smallest and most insignificant of the tribes with those damn Moabites as a great-grandma. Of course, let's follow this logic. I mean, that's the ancestry of Jesus, too. And you know that every Christmas when we sing those strange words, the root of Jesse? Well, that's what this is all about. Anyway, it comes to all this. God chose who? And why? Because Saul fell out of favor because of all these reasons I shared. And he also fell into a deep depression with wild mood swings and behavior that was unhinged from reality. Although the British Journal of Psychology would seem to be an unlikely source for biblical commentary, the British Journal of Psychology labeled King Saul the victim of work-related stress. And they offer a remarkable insight on this character in the Bible, and we may even relate to some of it. So, first, neither Samuel or God wanted the people to have a king in the first place. They relented, but they thought it was a bad idea from the beginning. And so, would you like to go into a new job with that kind of support from your bosses? And second, the people had never had a king before, so they could have only brought unrealistic expectations to his performance. A king acting like a king couldn't go well. 3, he had sticks and stones to fight people who had mastered the art of metal, iron chariots, spears, armor. Their enemies were at an impossible advantage, and he's supposed to lead that to victory? And fourth, Saul was supposed to be in charge, but he could only go into battle after Samuel gave him permission. Was he really in charge after all? So, no support, unrealistic expectations, performance expected against overwhelming odds, not allowed to make final decisions. And so, according to the journal, Saul's story shows a combination of high demands and low control, which can lead to psychological stress and even lead to chronic disease. Some of you know that kind of stress. Expectations that can't be met, conditions over which we have no control, and work demands that conflict with family needs. And yeah, I see a lot of you smiling and shaking your heads. Now, did you know among the fattest, sickest, and most depressed people in America are pastors? Pastors are among the fattest, sickest, and most depressed people in America. And you ask why? It's because they have impossible demands and unrealistic expectations of oneself and from others to reverse the cultural trend away from Christianity, resulting in congregations shrinking and closing. And when congregations are in stress, they look at the person most visible as their scapegoat. And sometimes when a congregation is shrinking, they get mean to each other. They treat each other worse instead of with more extra loving care. Fear does that. And this information was pre-pandemic, so let me tell you, it's a lot worse today. And I, every day, and I'm not kidding, give thanks for serving a group of healthy and hopeful people like you, specifically. But many of my colleagues are really working in situations with little hope or appreciation. And many of them are led to ask, God chose who? More than half of seminary graduates leave ministry before finishing 5 years in the church. Just say a prayer for them. So Saul descended farther and farther and finally into madness. But one thing gave him comfort, and it was music. And he will soon be introduced to an apple-cheeked little shepherd who liked to chase butterflies and watch clouds floating overhead, whose singing and harp playing were the only thing that soothed Saul's soul and gave him relief. Until Saul tried to kill him, and then tried to kill his own son, who fell in love with David. So those and many more lighthearted stories yet to come. So why do I tell these stories? Because these characters are fascinating. They are not fairy tales with happy endings. They are real. They're real people because they are our real stories too. They are true stories in the sense that we can find our own lives reflected in them, just like we try to do the best in situations where we have no control and try to meet expectations we can't possibly meet and have demands that conflict with what our families need from us. Sometimes we need help. And stories like these provide comfort. Like, first of all, you're not alone. Even Jesus asked, "Why have you forsaken me?" And so like Saul, maybe you can try a little music therapy. But unlike Saul, we have access to so much more than that. So when we need it, seek help. Follow the advice of your physician. Seek guidance from a psychologist or psychiatrist. Take the medicine that is prescribed. It is as important for our mind as much as it is for our body, because our mind is part of our body. And remember that all of these resources are God-given gifts that are thankfully available today and that were not available for people like Saul. And in his time, they had no explanation for what Saul was going through, and so they said he was plagued by an evil spirit. Somehow people still use that language today instead of recognizing that he had undiagnosed mental health challenges, which is not a sign of evil or judgment. So, back to our original story. I love David's origin story, later to become the great King David with his own issues. But to me, here is the most important line of the whole text. Humans see what is visible to the eyes. God sees into the heart. Perhaps it seems too simplistic, but when you find yourself asking, God chose who? There's a reason God chose you. God sees your heart. And it's beautiful.